Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of Aiden's chef's knife against the aged maple butchering block was a familiar symphony, a sound as ingrained in his being as the scent of thyme and roasted garlic. Each julienned carrot, each perfectly brunoise shallot, was a testament to a decade of unwavering dedication. At 42, Aiden was not merely a chef. He was an artisan, a sculptor of flavors, and the Gilded Spoon, his beloved restaurant, was his masterpiece. Every detail, from the precise ambient lighting to the exact temperature of the consommé, was meticulously controlled, a reflection of his own disciplined psyche. This control, this pursuit of perfection, had been his North Star since he was a boy, guiding him through culinary school, grueling apprenticeships, and finally to the precipice of his restaurant's 10th anniversary gala. The gala was more than just an event. It was a defiant celebration of a dream realized, a testament to his singular vision. He ran a hand over the gleaming stainless steel of his prep table, a faint smile touching his lips. "Matteo," he called, his voice calm but authoritative, "are the truffles at room temperature? We need them to release their full aroma for the amuse-bouche." Matteo, his young sous chef, a man whose ambition mirrored Aiden's own, albeit on a smaller scale, nodded, already moving with practiced efficiency. "Yes, chef, just brought them out." Aiden hummed, already mentally preparing the next dish. His life was a series of perfectly executed steps, a recipe he had perfected. The kitchen was his sanctuary, a place where chaos bowed to order under his steady hand. Outside, the world might be unpredictable, but here, within these walls, he was sovereign. His only close family were two women who couldn't be more different from him. There was Bronte, his older sister, a whirlwind of vibrant colors and bohemian ideals. An artist who lived life as freely as he lived it strictly. Their interactions were often strained, a clash of their fundamentally opposing natures, but an unspoken bond, forged in childhood, always remained. Then there was Aunt Sylvie, his late mother's sister, a retired botanist with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ancient forests. She lived a quiet life on the outskirts of town, tending to her sprawling garden and occasionally dispensing cryptic, yet strangely profound advice. Aiden appreciated her grounding presence, a gentle counterpoint to his own high-strung intensity. He saw her usually once a month for Sunday dinner, a sacred ritual he never missed. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the rich scent of simmering stock. Aiden took a deep breath, a quiet sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was his life, perfectly calibrated, satisfyingly complete. It started subtly, like a dissonant note in a perfectly harmonious chord. A dull, persistent ache, a ghost behind his left eye. He'd rub his temple, attributing it to the long hours, the relentless pressure of the upcoming gala. His vision would occasionally flicker, like a faulty fluorescent bulb, but it was so fleeting, he'd dismiss it as eye strain from staring at fine print on invoices. Then came the tremor. Not a violent shake, but a slight, almost imperceptible tremble in his dominant right hand as he diced. He'd clench his fist, willing it away, attributing it to too much caffeine. "Chef, are you all right?" Matteo asked one afternoon, his brow furrowing as Aiden fumbled slightly with a delicate pastry brush. "You seem a bit off." Aiden scoffed, forcing a laugh. "Off? Just tired, Matteo. The gala is looming, you know how it is. My body is rebelling against my genius." He winked, a practiced deflection. He couldn't admit to any weakness, not now, not ever. His control was paramount, but the symptoms persisted, growing more insistent. The headache became a throbbing drumbeat. The flickering vision intensified, sometimes blurring the edges of his meticulously arranged mise en place. And the tremor, once fleeting, now lingered, making delicate tasks like piping a fine line of sauce a frustrating challenge. He found himself growing irritable, snapping at Matteo for minor infractions, something he rarely did. His usual calm precision was fraying at the edges. One evening, as he painstakingly plated a complex dish, his hands trembled so violently, a spoonful of caviar spilled onto the pristine white plate. He stared at it, a cold dread seeping into his gut. This wasn't just stress. This was something else, something insidious, something that threatened to unravel the very fabric of his carefully constructed world. He felt a nascent fear, a whisper of a possibility he refused to voice, even to himself. He was Aiden Thorne, the master of his domain, and his body would not betray him. The night of the gala was a blur of flashing lights, effusive praise, and the intoxicating hum of success. Aiden moved through the crowded dining room, a picture of calm confidence, accepting congratulations, his heart swelling with a hard-won pride. He gave a brief, heartfelt speech, thanking his team, his patrons, and finally raising a glass to the Gilded Spoon, his life's work. Then the world tilted, a sudden, blinding flash behind his left eye. The murmurs of the crowd morphed into a distorted roar. He felt a strange tingling sensation, starting in his right arm, creeping up to his face. The microphone slipped from his grasp. A wave of nausea, cold and visceral, swept over him. He tried to speak, to call for help, but his tongue felt thick, uncooperative. The elegant dining room spun, the faces of his guests blurring into a kaleidoscope of terror. He felt a violent jerk, a sensation as if an unseen force was seizing control of his limbs. Then, darkness. He came to, briefly, to the terrifying realization that he was on the floor, a circle of horrified faces staring down at him. A metallic taste filled his mouth. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The darkness swallowed him again. The sterile scent of antiseptic was the first thing he registered. Then, the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of medical machinery. He opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh, fluorescent light. Bronte was there, her usually vibrant hair disheveled, her face pale and etched with a fear he'd never seen before. She grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly tight. "Aiden, thank God! You scared us half to death." Her voice was choked with emotion. What happened?" His tongue felt thick, his voice a hoarse whisper. Just then, a doctor, a grave-faced man with tired eyes, entered the room. "Mr. Thorne, you had a seizure. We ran an MRI." He paused, his gaze softening with a practiced sympathy. "We found something, a mass in your left temporal lobe. It's aggressive. The preliminary diagnosis is glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Glioblastoma multiforme, grade 1. He didn't understand the jargon, but the tone, the doctor's grim expression, spoke volumes. It was cancer, brain cancer, the kind that killed. A profound, icy terror gripped him, squeezing the air from his lungs. His perfectly controlled world, his meticulously crafted life, shattered around him like a dropped crystal glass. The gala, the restaurant, the very essence of his identity. It all seemed meaningless, distant. The door creaked open again, and Aunt Sylvie entered. Her eyes, usually so bright with life, now holding a deep, ancient sorrow. She didn't say anything, just walked to his bedside, her hand gently covering Bronte's on his arm. Her presence was a quiet anchor in the roaring storm of his shock and disbelief. He saw a tear trace a path down Bronte's cheek. He felt nothing but a hollow emptiness, a terrifying sense of betrayal by his own body. The master artisan, the man of perfect control, was utterly, terrifyingly out of control. He ran a hand over the gleaming stainless steel of his prep table, a faint ache blooming behind his left eye. He dismissed it as a phantom echo of the previous night's late service, a consequence of scrutinizing every dish before it left the pass. Lately, these subtle disquietudes had begun to prick at the edges of his meticulously ordered world. A persistent, dull throb, like a distant drum, had taken up residence just behind his left orbital bone. And then there were the visual disturbances, fleeting blurs, a momentary flicker as if a faulty bulb had winked out in his peripheral vision, usually when he was focusing intently on a delicate garnish. Just yesterday, while meticulously dicing chives for a consommé, his dominant right hand, usually as steady as a surgeon's, had betrayed him with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. A single chive had flown off the board, a tiny green projectile, shattering the illusion of his perfect control. He'd scoffed at himself, attributing it to fatigue, to the grueling hours leading up to the gala. Stress, he'd thought. Just stress. He was a chef, a master of endurance. Minor physical complaints were just the price of admission. Besides, he had too much on his plate, literally and figuratively, to entertain such trifles. "Chef?" Matteo's voice, deferential yet sharp, cut through Aiden's internal monologue. His sous chef, a young man barely out of culinary school, but with an instinct for flavor that rivaled Aiden's own, stood by the walk-in, a box of fresh scallops in his arms. "Are these up to your standard for the amuse-bouche?" Aiden turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's see them." He took a scallop, examining its pearly sheen, its plumpness. He found himself blinking, the image in his right eye momentarily blurring, then sharpening again. He frowned imperceptibly. Matteo, ever observant, hesitated. "Are you all right, chef? You seem a little off today. And yesterday, during the pâté prep, you seemed a bit irritable." His tone was concerned, not accusatory. Aiden bristled, a tightness coiling in his chest. "I'm fine, Matteo. Just focused. The gala is 2 days away, and we have no room for error." He handed back the scallop. "These are acceptable. Let's get them seared to perfection." His voice was sharper than he intended, the edge a product of his frustration with his own body's perceived rebellion. He hated feeling anything less than 100%, especially now. It was a betrayal of his own rigid standards. Matteo nodded, but his brow remained subtly furrowed. He'd noticed the flickers, the slight unsteadiness in Aiden's gait when he thought no one was watching. He'd even caught Aiden rubbing his temple repeatedly, a gesture uncharacteristic of the usually stoic chef. There was a new brittle tension around Aiden, a barely contained agitation that was slowly eroding his customary calm. The perfectionist was faltering, and Matteo, who revered Aiden's unwavering control, found it unsettling. He wondered if the pressure of the gala was finally getting to the great Aiden, but the sight of Aiden's hands trembling ever so slightly as he poured olive oil into a pan, an almost imperceptible shiver, niggled at him. It wasn't just stress. Matteo instinctively knew it. He just didn't know what else it could be. The night of the gala arrived, a whirlwind of gleaming crystal, hushed anticipation, and the intoxicating aroma of Aiden's culinary artistry. The Gilded Spoon was packed, a constellation of city elite, food critics, and loyal patrons. Aiden moved through the kitchen like a conductor, orchestrating every dish, every plating, every precisely timed delivery. The adrenaline was a potent balm, momentarily dulling the persistent ache behind his eye, steadying his hand. He felt a surge of triumph as he watched his creations carried out, each a miniature masterpiece. The dinner service was flawless, a testament to his vision. As the last dessert was cleared, Aiden, flushed with success, stepped into the dining room, ready to deliver his carefully prepared speech. The applause was thunderous, a wave of affirmation washing over him. He reached the small podium, a microphone in hand, a sense of profound satisfaction swelling within him. He began to speak, his voice clear and resonant, recounting the decade-long journey of the Gilded Spoon, his gratitude to his team, his passion for his craft. Then a sudden searing pain lanced through his left temple, blindingly bright. The room began to spin, the faces of his guests blurring into indistinct smudges. The microphone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. His knees buckled, and a strange metallic taste filled his mouth. The elegant chandelier above him seemed to pulsate, its light distorting, stretching, then fracturing into 1,000 brilliant, chaotic shards. He felt a jolt, a violent tremor that convulsed his entire body, sending him crashing to the polished floor. The last thing he heard before darkness consumed him was a collective gasp, followed by the horrified cry of Matteo, "Chef, Aiden!" The transition from the opulent chaos of the gala to the stark, sterile white of the emergency room was jarring. Fragments of memory flickered through Aiden's mind. The blur of paramedics, the distant wail of a siren, the insistent beeping of machines. He woke to the unsettling scent of antiseptic, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes and a profound sense of disorientation. A nurse, her face kind but weary, was adjusting an IV drip in his arm. "Mr. Thorne, you're in St. Jude's. You had a seizure." A seizure. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick, uncooperative. Days bled into a terrifying blur of tests, consultations, and the chillingly detached language of medical professionals. The precise, controlled world he had built around himself crumbled with each passing hour. The MRI, a hulking, impersonal machine, hummed its grim diagnosis. "Mr. Thorne," Dr. Aris, a neurologist with kind but grave eyes, began, her voice clinically soft. "The imaging shows a mass in your left temporal lobe." She paused, her gaze steady, resolute. "It's large and aggressive. We believe it's glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4. The words hit Aiden like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Glioblastoma, grade 4. He knew enough, from stray articles and medical dramas, to understand the devastating weight of that diagnosis. It was a death sentence, whispered in hushed tones, a monstrous invader that devoured lives. His mind reeled, grasping for purchase, for control, but there was only a terrifying void. His meticulously planned future, his restaurant, his mastery, all of it dissolved into an agonizing haze of fear. He barely registered the flurry of activity around him until a hand, unexpectedly firm and warm, clasped his own. He opened his eyes to see Bronte, her usually wild auburn hair pulled back, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, stark with fear. Her bright, artistic eyes, usually brimming with light, were wide, swimming with unshed tears. The carefree spirit he associated with his estranged sister was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral terror that mirrored his own. She squeezed his hand, her knuckles white. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Oh, Aiden." Then a quiet presence at the foot of his bed. Aunt Sylvie. She stood there, her silver braids framing a face etched with a wisdom that seemed to predate time. Her eyes, usually twinkling with mischief or contemplation, held a deep, ancient sorrow, a profound understanding of the fragility of life. She didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes, but simply met his gaze, a quiet resolve emanating from her. There was no pity in her eyes, only a profound, knowing grief that seemed to acknowledge the enormity of what had just been irrevocably shattered. The carefully constructed walls of Aiden's world had not just crumbled, they had been obliterated, leaving him exposed, terrified, and utterly alone in the face of an uninvited, monstrous guest. He'd scoffed at himself, attributing it to fatigue, to the relentless pressure of the upcoming gala. "Just need a break, chef," Mateo had said, his young eyes sharp and perceptive, observing Aiden's increased irritability, the slight, almost imperceptible unsteadiness in his stance as he surveyed the kitchen. Aiden had merely grunted, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand, a gesture that felt heavier than usual. He couldn't afford a break, not now, not with everything riding on the gala. The symptoms were an annoyance, a minor glitch in the otherwise perfectly calibrated machine of his life, certainly not something to derail the culmination of a decade's work. He pushed them down, deeper into the recesses of his mind, just as he pushed down the nascent fear that began to prick at the edges of his unwavering confidence. The night of the gala arrived, a glittering spectacle of culinary excellence. The gilded spoons shimmered under the bespoke lighting, every table set with an almost surgical precision. Aiden, dressed impeccably in his chef whites, moved through the room, a veritable god in his domain, accepting accolades, overseeing every plate that left the kitchen. The hum of conversation, the clinking of crystal, the rich aroma of his carefully crafted menu filled the air. A symphony he had composed. He felt a surge of pride, a deep, resonant satisfaction. This was it. This was everything. He was midway through his speech, a carefully rehearsed ode to passion, dedication, and the relentless pursuit of perfection, when the world began to tilt. The elegant faces in the crowd blurred, their smiles stretching into grotesque caricatures. The carefully chosen words caught in his throat, replaced by a sudden metallic taste. The dull ache behind his eye intensified, exploding into a blinding supernova of pain. He gripped the podium, knuckles white, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The room spun, the polished floor surging up to meet him. A high-pitched whine filled his ears, drowning out the murmurs of concern. He tried to speak, to apologize, to dismiss it as a momentary weakness, but his tongue felt thick and unwieldy. His vision tunneled, contracting to a single pinprick of light, then nothing. He vaguely registered the shouts, the rush of footsteps, the concerned faces of Mateo and a few of his more loyal patrons. Then, the world went black. He awoke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the persistent beep of unfamiliar machinery. His head throbbed with an agony far beyond any headache he had ever experienced. A cool hand was on his forehead. Bronte. Her face was pale, her usually vibrant, chaotic curls subdued, her eyes wide with a fear he had rarely seen there. "Aiden? Can you hear me? You're in the hospital." Her voice was tight with unshed tears. He tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. He felt disoriented, adrift. What happened? The gala. "You had a seizure, Aiden," a calm, professional voice said. He turned his head with effort. A doctor, young but with weary eyes, stood beside his bed. "We've run some tests, an MRI. A knot of dread tightened in Aiden's stomach. The way the doctor paused, the grim set of his jaw. "Aiden, we found a mass in your left temporal lobe." The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Mass, tumor, cancer. His mind, usually so sharp, struggled to process. Bronte gasped, a strangled sound, and clutched his hand tighter. "What does that mean, doctor?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The doctor sighed, a weary exhalation. "It's a glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4. It's aggressive. We need to be honest, Aiden. It's serious." Glioblastoma. The word felt alien, monstrous. It didn't belong in his perfectly ordered life, in his perfectly controlled body. This was something that happened to other people, to strangers in news reports, not to Aiden, the meticulous chef, the master of control. Aunt Sylvie arrived a few hours later, her presence a quiet ripple in the sterile hospital room. She was wearing her usual eclectic mix of earthy tones and handcrafted jewelry, a small, gnarled wooden staff in one hand. Her eyes, usually twinkling with mischief, held a deep, ancient sorrow, a knowing resignation that chilled Aiden to the bone. She didn't speak much, just sat by his bedside, her hand gently tracing patterns on his arm, a silent anchor in the storm of his terror. Bronte, usually so fiercely independent, so quick with a witty retort, was utterly undone. She kept smoothing his hair back from his forehead, her touch trembling. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "This isn't fair. It's just not fair." Her carefree demeanor had vanished, replaced by a stark, raw fear that mirrored his own. Aiden lay there, the beeping of the machines, a relentless reminder of his new reality. His empire, the gilded spoon, his meticulous life, all of it lay shattered around him like a dropped crystal glass. The uninvited guest had arrived, and it was demanding far more than a seat at his table. It was demanding his very life. And for the first time, Aiden, the man who controlled everything, felt utterly, terrifyingly out of control. The subtle tremors, the headaches, the flickering vision, they weren't small glitches. They were the harbingers of this monstrous, insidious invasion. His perfectly ordered world had been irrevocably breached. The sterile scent of the hospital room clung to Aiden like a shroud, a bitter perfume that replaced the comforting aromas of garlic and thyme. The diagnosis, glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4, had ripped through his meticulously constructed world, leaving gaping, bleeding wounds. Now the healing began, not with the precision of a chef's knife, but with the blunt force of radiation and chemotherapy. His first session felt like a betrayal. Strapped to a table under the humming maw of the linear accelerator, he felt the invisible beams penetrate his skull, a chilling sensation that told him his body, once a finely tuned instrument, was now a battleground. The metallic taste in his mouth, the sudden, overwhelming fatigue, these were the first harbingers of the war within. Chemotherapy was worse. The nausea became a constant companion, a churning vortex in his stomach that made even the thought of food repulsive. His once robust body began to waste away, the sharp angles of his cheekbones becoming more pronounced, his skin taking on a sallow hue. He watched in the mirror as clumps of his once thick hair began to fall, first in delicate strands, then in horrifying handfuls, until his scalp was a pale, vulnerable landscape. He ran a hand over it, a ghost of a tremor, remembering the days he'd meticulously styled it before service. Now even that small act felt like a monumental effort. The worst, though, was the cognitive fog. It was like trying to navigate a dense, unyielding pea souper. Words eluded him, slipping away just as he reached for them. Recipes, once etched into his memory with photographic precision, were now a jumble of ingredients and forgotten steps. He'd stare at a blank page, his pen poised, the complex symphony of a dish reduced to a discordant note. He tried to read, to immerse himself in the culinary journals he loved. But the words swam before his eyes, their meaning dissolving into an unintelligible blur. His mind, the very engine of his craft, was failing him, and with it, his sense of self. Matteo, bless his earnest heart, visited every day, bringing updates from the Gilded Spoon. "Chef, the anniversary gala was, well, it was good. We managed, but it wasn't the same without you." Aiden would nod, a flicker of pride mingled with a crushing wave of despair. He saw the subtle changes Matteo had made, a slight adjustment to the plating, a new interpretation of a classic. He knew Matteo was trying to keep his vision alive, but it felt like a distortion, a faint echo of what he'd built. He wanted to shout, to correct, to take back control, but the words wouldn't form, and the energy wasn't there. Bronte, ever the free spirit, found herself tethered to his bedside. She'd bring him books, play music he barely registered, and try to engage him in conversation. "Aiden, remember that time you tried to make a souffle with expired eggs and it exploded all over the kitchen?" she'd ask, her voice light, attempting to conjure a memory he could grasp. He'd offer a weak smile, the effort exhausting. He saw the fear in her eyes, the helplessness that mirrored his own. She'd always been the one to run, to escape, but now she was here, rooted, and he hated that she had to witness his decline. He hated that he couldn't offer her the comfort she sought, that he was the object of her pity. One afternoon, during a particularly aggressive wave of nausea, he lashed out, "Just leave me alone, Bronte. Can't you see I'm done?" His voice was hoarse, raw with self-pity and frustration. She flinched, her face crumpling, and then she left, her footsteps echoing in the silence. A part of him wanted to call her back, to apologize, but the exhaustion was too profound, the bitterness too potent. Aunt Sylvie, however, was a different kind of presence. She didn't bring books or try to lighten the mood. She would simply sit by his bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her gaze deep and unwavering. She emanated a calm, a strength that was both comforting and at times infuriating. He was a man who believed in action, in doing, in fighting. Her quiet presence felt like an invitation to surrender, and he wasn't ready for that. He was still clinging to the tattered remnants of his control. "The body is a garden, Aiden," she murmured one day, her voice a soft rustle of dry leaves. "And sometimes the roots grow tangled, pulling at the very foundations." He grunted, turning his head away. He didn't want cryptic wisdom. He wanted a cure. He wanted his body back, his mind back, his life back. This slow, agonizing erosion was far worse than any sudden collapse. He was a chef, a creator, a master of his domain. Now he was a prisoner in his own dissolving realm, and the bitterness was a recipe he was forced to consume every single day. The taste was unbearable. His once robust body began to waste away, the sharp angles of his cheekbones becoming more pronounced, his skin taking on a sallow hue. The hair, a source of quiet pride, began to fall out in clumps, clogging the shower drain, a visceral reminder of his unraveling. Worst of all, the cognitive fog descended, thick and suffocating. Recipes once etched in his memory with perfect clarity became a jumble of ingredients. He'd try to explain a dish to Matteo, only to find himself fumbling for words, the precise culinary terms replaced by vague gestures and frustrated grunts. His famed precision, his very identity, was dissolving into a haze. Mateo, bless his steady heart, tried to hold the kitchen together. He'd call Aiden daily, his voice apologetic, asking for guidance. "Chef, the reduction on the jus, it's not quite right. Should I add more time?" Aiden would stare at the phone, the question echoing in his head, meaningless. "Just make it work, Mateo," he'd rasp, then hang up, the phone feeling impossibly heavy in his trembling hand. He knew Mateo was struggling, knew the reputation of the gilded spoon, his life's work, was teetering. But he felt an apathy so profound, it was almost physical. He simply didn't care. Bronte, her usual vibrant energy muted by concern, hovered. She'd bring him organic broths he couldn't stomach, read aloud from cookbooks he couldn't follow, her voice a gentle, constant hum in the background. She tried to engage him, to talk about anything but his illness, but he'd retreat further into himself, the effort of even a simple conversation feeling monumental. He saw the pity in her eyes, a reflection of his own decaying self, and he hated it. He hated being seen this way, stripped of his competence, his control. 2 months into the grueling regimen, the follow-up MRI was scheduled. Aiden went, not with hope, but with a grim sense of obligation. He lay in the cold, humming tube, a prisoner in his own skull, listening to the monotonous thrumming, a soundtrack to his slow demise. When Dr. Allister, his oncologist, called him back into the sterile consultation room, the news was delivered with a practiced gravitas that nevertheless felt like a death knell. "Aiden," Dr. Allister began, his voice soft. "The images, they don't show the response we had hoped for." He gestured to the glowing, ominous mass on the screen. "The tumor, it hasn't shrunk. In fact, there's some indication of marginal growth and new enhancements surrounding the primary lesion." Aiden stared at the screen, at the angry white shape in his brain. It was a monster, a parasite, mocking his efforts, growing stronger despite the poison he'd willingly ingested. "So, it's not working?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Dr. Allister sighed, a weary sound. "Conventional therapies, particularly for grade 4 glioblastoma, are often about management, not cure. We can explore more aggressive options, experimental chemotherapies, targeted radiation, but the prognoses, Aiden, are grim. We're talking about extending life, not necessarily regaining quality of life." The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Extending life, not regaining quality of life. What kind of life would that be? A shadow of his former self, a chef who couldn't taste, a man who couldn't think. The despair that had been a dull ache now erupted into a searing blaze. He went home, the hospital's sterile scent replaced by the lingering smell of disinfectant from his own bathroom. He looked at his reflection, gaunt, bald, eyes sunken and haunted. The chef was gone, replaced by this victim, and it was all their fault. The doctors for failing him. Bronte for hovering with her pitying gaze. Mateo for making him feel like a burden. Even Aunt Sylvie with her gentle, knowing nods that felt like judgment. Everyone was complicit in his decline. The rage, a primal, untamed beast, began to claw its way out. Bronte found him in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. "Aiden, the doctor's office just called. They want to schedule..." "Schedule what, Bronte?" he snarled, turning on her, his voice hoarse. "Schedule my demise? Are you happy now? You always wanted me to slow down, didn't you? To stop being so driven. Well, you got your wish." His words were a venomous spray, born of fear and self-loathing. Bronte flinched, her face paling. "Aiden, that's not fair. I'm here for you. I'm trying to help." "Help?" he scoffed, pushing himself up from the sofa, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. "You're just here to watch the show, aren't you? To see the great Aiden brought low. Well, congratulations, you've got a front row seat." He stumbled past her, the effort of walking almost too much, and slammed his bedroom door shut, leaving her standing alone, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He started rejecting visitors. Mateo called, wanting to visit, but Aiden snapped, "Don't bother, Mateo. Just focus on the restaurant. What's left of it." He knew he was being cruel, but a perverse satisfaction came from pushing people away, from controlling this one last thing. who got to witness his degradation. Even Aunt Sylvie, with her quiet strength, became an object of his scorn. She came one afternoon carrying a small, gnarled branch in her hand, smelling faintly of damp earth and something wild like pine. She sat by his bed, not speaking, simply radiating a calm presence that Aiden found unbearable. "What do you want, Aunt Sylvie?" he demanded, his voice thin. "To tell me about the healing power of dandelions?" "I'm dying, Aunt Sylvie. There's no plant for this." Her eyes, deep and ancient, held his. "We are all dying, Aiden," she said, her voice a low murmur. "The question is, how do we live until then? And what do we carry with us?" "I carry a tumor, Aunt Sylvie," he spat, the words laced with bitterness. "A growing, monstrous thing that's eating me alive. And I carry the knowledge that I've lost everything. My restaurant, my hands, my mind, my control." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not pity, but profound sorrow. "Control," she repeated almost to herself. "A heavy burden, my dear. Sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we choose to carry." She rose, placing the gnarled branch on his nightstand. "I will leave this here, and I will leave you to your burdens, Aiden. But remember, even the mightiest oak must shed its leaves to grow anew." She left, her footsteps soft, leaving him alone with the silent branch, its rough texture a strange counterpoint to the smooth, cold pills on his nightstand. He lay there, simmering in his own toxic brew of anger and despair. He was losing control, utterly and completely, and the thought was a torment worse than the physical pain. He had always prided himself on his iron will, his ability to shape the world to his precise specifications. Now, his body, his mind, his very existence felt utterly out of his grasp. The tumor was not just a physical mass, it was a physical manifestation of his greatest fear, utter powerlessness. And in his desperate clinging to what little control he had left, the control to push everyone away, to choose his own lonely, bitter end, he only tightened the noose around his own neck. The thought of the experimental treatments, of more invasive procedures with such low chances of success, filled him with a cold dread. What was the point? To prolong this agonizing, humiliating descent? He closed his eyes, wishing for an end, any end, to the crushing weight of a life that was no longer his own. The phone heavy in his hand, a tangible weight of his loss of control. He couldn't even taste the jus anymore. His palate dulled, his senses muted by the onslaught of chemicals coursing through him. His condition deteriorated further. The headaches intensified, no longer dull aches but searing, relentless throbs behind his left eye. Moments of confusion became more frequent, stretches of time where he couldn't recall how he'd ended up in his armchair, or what he'd agreed to just minutes before. Memory lapses plagued him, small, terrifying gaps in his day that felt like black holes swallowing precious moments. Bronte, bless her, tried. She'd bring him organic juices, read to him from his favorite cookbooks, a cruel irony, an attempt to coax him into conversation. But her efforts often met with a wall of his profound irritability. "What's the point, Bronte?" he'd snapped one afternoon, tossing a medical pamphlet onto the floor. "They're just delaying the inevitable. This is it. I'm a broken chef, a broken man." His voice was laced with a bitterness that surprised even him. A follow-up MRI, meant to offer a glimmer of hope after weeks of brutal treatment, instead delivered a crushing blow. The tumor, a malignant phantom, had not shrunk. If anything, the radiologist's careful, hedging words suggested it might have even grown slightly. The doctors, their faces etched with professional sympathy, offered grim prognoses. More aggressive, experimental treatments were discussed, their efficacy rates presented with disheartening disclaimers and lists of horrendous side effects. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his former life, a confirmation that his meticulous control over his destiny had utterly vanished. "What's the point?" he'd repeated to Bronte later, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "They're just cutting me open to stitch me back up, a Frankenstein's monster of what I once was. And for what? To buy a few more months of this living death?" His despair was a palpable thing in the room, a cold, suffocating blanket. He began to lash out, his frustration and fear manifesting as irrational anger. Mateo, who visited daily with updates from the restaurant, became a frequent target. "You're letting the standards slip, Mateo," Aiden would accuse, his voice rising, even though he hadn't been to the Gilded Spoon in months. "I can taste it from here. You're ruining my legacy." Mateo would flinch, his young face etched with hurt, but he never argued, only nodded. His shoulders slumped. Bronte too bore the brunt of his rage. "Why are you here, Bronte? To watch me die? To gloat that your flighty, artistic life is so much freer than my disciplined, successful one?" The words were cruel, born of a desperate self-pity that twisted his perception. Bronte, though visibly wounded, would just sit quietly, her hand resting on his arm, a gesture he often shrugged off. He started rejecting visitors. Friends from the culinary world, his few remaining acquaintances, he pushed them all away. Their well-meaning pity felt like a condemnation. Even Aunt Sylvie, whose quiet presence had once been a source of comfort, found herself met with a closed door, both literally and figuratively. "Just leave me alone," he'd snarled through the wood, the darkness of his room a perfect reflection of the darkness in his mind. He was withdrawing, shrinking into himself, consumed by the crushing weight of his lost control. Aunt Sylvie, however, was not one to be deterred by a closed door or a harsh word. One afternoon, Aiden found a small, hand-bound journal on his bedside table, left there by Sylvie during one of his medicated naps. Its cover was a deep forest green, embossed with a single silver fern. Inside, the pages were filled with elegant, flowing script, interwoven with delicate, precise botanical illustrations of roots, leaves, and twisting vines. Cryptic poems about releasing the root and the hidden strength of surrender were scattered throughout. He scoffed, tossing it aside. More of Sylvie's New Age nonsense. Yet a few days later, a strange man appeared at his door. He introduced himself as Julian, a former concert pianist. He had a serene, almost luminous quality about him. "Aunt Sylvie thought we might have something in common," Julian said, his voice soft, melodic. Aiden, too weak to protest vehemently, allowed him in. Julian spoke not of music, but of his recovery from a debilitating stroke that had paralyzed his right hand. He shared his journey of intense sound therapy, not as a cure, but as a path to surrendering to the flow of healing, of letting go of his desperate need to control every note, every movement, and allowing his body to rediscover its own rhythm. Aiden, initially cynical, found himself listening, a sliver of curiosity piercing his despair. Julian's story wasn't about a miraculous medical cure, but about an inner transformation that had somehow, inexplicably, coincided with his physical recovery. Over the next few weeks, more visitors arrived, each seemingly arranged by Aunt Sylvie. There was a woman, a former mountain climber, who had lost a leg in an avalanche but spoke of finding a deeper freedom in her prosthetic than she ever had on 2 feet, a freedom born of releasing the illusion of invincibility. There was a former architect who had gone blind, yet now saw the world with a richer, more profound inner vision after letting go of his reliance on external structures. Each story was different, yet a common thread wove through them, the profound power of relinquishing control, of surrendering to an unknown path, and finding unexpected resilience and even joy on the other side of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Aiden listened, his cynical shell slowly cracking. He still scoffed, still muttered about woo-woo nonsense. But the desperation gnawing at him was so profound, so all-consuming, that even these unconventional narratives began to find purchase. He saw in their eyes not pity, but a deep understanding, a quiet strength that resonated with something ancient within him. He started picking up Aunt Sylvie's journal, his fingers tracing the botanical illustrations. The cryptic poems about releasing the root no longer seemed so nonsensical. He wasn't sure what any of this meant for his tumor, for his rapidly fading life, but for the first time in months, a tiny flicker of something, not hope, not yet, but a desperate need for something, anything to change, began to stir within him. "I'm just waiting to die." He'd watched her flinch, her usually vibrant face crumpling, and felt a perverse satisfaction in her pain, a twisted echo of his own helplessness. A follow-up MRI confirmed his darkest fears. The doctors, their faces grim and professional, showed him the new scans. The mass, once a menacing, nebulous cloud, now seemed to have sharpened its edges, a predatory presence in the landscape of his brain. "It hasn't shrunk, Aiden," Dr. Albright began, her voice carefully modulated. "In fact, there's some indication of slight progression." The words hit him like a physical blow, each syllable a hammer stroke against the fragile edifice of his remaining hope. They spoke of aggressive experimental treatments, of low success rates, of quality of life versus prolonging the inevitable. He heard none of it, the words dissolving into a meaningless hum. All he saw was the image on the screen, a dark star consuming him from within. He lashed out, a venomous, cornered animal. "This is useless," he'd yelled, pushing away Bronte's comforting hand. "All of it. The drugs, the scans, your endless pity." He'd accused Mateo of letting standards slip at the restaurant, his voice laced with unreasoning fury. "You're letting the Gilded Spoon become a diner, aren't you? You think I don't know? You think I don't see?" Mateo, pale and hurt, had stammered a denial, but Aiden was beyond reason. He sent them all away, retreating into the suffocating confines of his apartment, the blinds drawn, the air thick with his despair. He refused Aunt Sylvie's calls, ignored her persistent knocks. He wanted to be alone, to drown in his bitterness, convinced that everyone, even those who loved him, simply pitied the broken chef. Yet Aunt Sylvie, with her quiet persistence, was not easily deterred. One afternoon, he found a small, oddly shaped package by his door. It wasn't a meal, or flowers, or another self-help book. It was a hand-bound journal, its cover a deep forest green, embossed with a swirling, intricate pattern of roots and leaves. He picked it up, a flicker of curiosity piercing his apathy. On the first page in Aunt Sylvie's elegant, looping script was a single line. "The root, when unseen, yet binds the deepest." He tossed it onto the coffee table, dismissing it as another one of her eccentricities. But then the visitors began. Aunt Sylvie had a way of appearing, unannounced, leaving behind not just the journal, but carefully chosen individuals. The first was a woman named Eleanor, her fingers gnarled with arthritis, her face etched with lines of profound suffering. Yet her eyes held a steady, incandescent light. She introduced herself as a former concert pianist. "My hands," she said, looking at her twisted fingers with surprising tenderness. "They were my life." Then the stroke came. Doctors said I'd never play again. I couldn't even hold a fork. Aiden listened, skeptical, but something in her calm, unwavering gaze held him. Eleanor spoke not of miracle cures, but of finding a different kind of music in her recovery, of intense, unconventional sound therapy, of surrendering to the flow of healing, of letting go of the perfect, precise movements she'd once demanded of her body. "I had to stop fighting," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "I had to listen to what my body needed, not what I wanted it to do." A few days later, a man named Samuel arrived, a former mountain climber who had lost a leg in a climbing accident. He spoke of the mountain's indifference, of the brutal beauty of its power, and how he had raged against his fate until he realized his true strength lay not in conquering the mountain, but in accepting its lessons. He now led expeditions for amputees, finding a new purpose in guiding others towards their own summits. "Control is an illusion, Aiden," he'd said, his eyes direct and unflinching. "Life happens to us. We choose how we respond to its currents." Aiden, initially resistant, found himself listening. He'd sit in his armchair, nursing a perpetual headache, and these strangers would speak, their voices weaving into the oppressive silence of his apartment. They weren't peddling false hope or miracle cures. They spoke of resilience, of adaptation, of finding meaning in the midst of profound loss. The common thread, he slowly realized, was a relinquishing of control, a surrender to something larger than their own will. It was unsettling, yet it resonated with a part of him that was utterly exhausted by the relentless grip he'd maintained on his own life. The journal lay on the coffee table, its green cover seeming to beckon. One restless night, sleep eluding him, Aiden reached for it. He thumbed through the pages, the scent of aged paper and dried herbs filling his nostrils. The botanical illustrations were exquisite, detailed renderings of roots, stems, and blossoms, each accompanied by a short, enigmatic poem. He skimmed past several, his mind still clouded, until a specific verse caught his eye. The root, when unseen, yet binds the deepest. A sorrow forgotten, a silent keeper. It feeds the shadow, though light may call. Unearth the buried, lest the forest fall. A sorrow forgotten. The words echoed in his mind, persistent, unsettling. He traced the intricately drawn roots with his finger, a strange unease settling over him. A silent keeper. What sorrow? His life, he prided himself, had been meticulously ordered, his emotions locked away, controlled. Yet a memory, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog. A summer day, bright and merciless. The scent of cut grass, the sound of laughter, then a scream. Leo, his younger brother, 8 years his junior, a whirlwind of boundless energy and infectious joy. Aiden, 15, had been tasked with watching him. Just for a moment, he'd turned his back, distracted by a conversation with a friend, consumed by some trivial teenage drama. Leo, always adventurous, had chased a ball too far, too fast, into the road. The screech of tires, the sickening thud. The world had gone silent, then shattered. Aiden had always blamed himself. The weight of it, a silent, crushing burden, had settled deep within him, a tumor of grief. He had never spoken of it, not to his parents, not to Bronte, who was away at college at the time. He had buried it, deep beneath layers of meticulous work, of perfectionism, of an obsessive need to control every single variable in his life, convinced that if he just controlled enough, nothing bad would ever happen again. No more unexpected tragedies, no more uncontrollable loss. His kitchen, his recipes, his entire life had become a fortress against the chaos of the world, against the raw, unbearable pain of that moment. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. His need for control, his meticulous perfectionism, even the quiet resentment he harbored towards Bronte for her carefree spirit. It all stemmed from that unaddressed grief. And the tumor, the glioblastoma, aggressive and uncontrollable, a malignant growth defying all his efforts to contain it. Was it a cruel manifestation of that buried sorrow, an outward expression of an internal wound he had refused to heal? The line between physical and psychological illness, once so clear, blurred into an unsettling haze. Aunt Sylvie, as if sensing the shift, appeared at his door again, this time with a thermos of herbal tea. He didn't fight her. He let her in, the words tumbling out of him, ragged and raw. He spoke of Leo, of the accident, of the years of silent blame. He spoke of the endless pursuit of perfection, the suffocating need for control, the fear that had dictated every decision, every perfectly diced vegetable, every precisely measured ingredient. Aunt Sylvie listened, her face serene, her eyes filled with an ancient compassion. She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She simply held his hand, her touch cool and grounding. "Grief is a river, Aiden," she whispered, her voice soft as rustling leaves. "When you dam it up, it finds other ways to flow. Sometimes it erodes the very banks it was meant to nourish." And then, for the first time in decades, Aiden wept. Not the frustrated tears of a man losing control, but a deep, primal wail of grief for the little brother he'd lost, for the boy he'd been, for the life he'd built as a monument to his unaddressed pain. He cried until his body shook, until there were no more tears left, until the bitter knot in his chest began, infinitesimally, to loosen. It was raw, it was ugly, and it was the most liberating thing he had ever experienced. A glimmer of hope, fragile but real, began to flicker in the dark chambers of his despair. He had finally, truly, begun to cry for Leo. His rage, venomous and cornered, had been a desperate shield, but even that began to corrode under the relentless assault of his failing body. The persistent headaches became blinding migraines, punctuated by flashes of light and then, terrifyingly, darkness. There were moments when his vision tunneled, his hearing dulled, and a chilling numbness crept up his left side. Bronte, her face etched with worry, had to hold his hand steady to help him drink a glass of water. Aunt Sylvie, despite his previous rejections, continued to visit. her presence a quiet anchor in the stormy chaos of his decline. She'd sit by his bed, sometimes speaking in soft murmurs about the resilience of ancient trees, sometimes just holding his hand, emitting a calm, solid presence that, despite himself, Aidan found marginally less irritating than Bronte's fretful ministrations. One afternoon, a sharp, searing pain exploded behind his left eye, unlike anything he'd experienced before. It was as if a red-hot poker had been plunged into his brain. His body seized, convulsing violently, his limbs flailing uncontrollably. Bronte, who had been in the room reading to him, screamed. He heard her panicked cries distantly as the world dissolved into a cacophony of distorted sounds and blinding light. Then blackness. Profound, absolute, terrifying blackness. He awoke, or perhaps descended, into a disorienting, vivid dreamscape. He was in the kitchen of the Gilded Spoon, but everything was wrong. The air was thick and cloying, shimmering with heat, and a monstrous, shapeless mass of dough pulsed ominously on the gleaming stainless steel counter. It was pale and gelatinous, swelling and contracting with a sickening rhythm, filling the entire space. He tried to push against it, to knead it, to control it, but it was vast and unresponsive, absorbing his efforts, growing larger, more suffocating. This was it, he realized with a jolt of primal fear. This was the tumor, the ultimate manifestation of his inability to control, his deepest terror. He struggled, pushing with all his might, his muscles straining, but the dough only expanded, pushing him back, trapping him against the cold, unforgiving wall. Panic clawed at his throat. He couldn't breathe. The familiar aroma of yeast and flour had turned putrid, metallic. He was drowning in it, being consumed. He screamed, a silent, desperate scream that vibrated through his dream body. He hammered his fists against the undulating mass, but it was futile. His strength ebbed, his resistance crumbled. A profound exhaustion settled over him, heavier than any physical fatigue. He had fought, he had controlled, he had manipulated, and it had all led to this. There was nothing more to do. He closed his eyes, a wave of profound, weary surrender washing over him. He stopped fighting. He let go. And then something shifted. The suffocating pressure eased. The putrid smell dissipated, replaced by a fresh, clean scent, like rain on warm earth. He dared to open his eyes. The monstrous dough was no longer there. In its place, a luminous, shimmering river flowed through the kitchen, its surface reflecting a soft, golden light. It moved with a gentle, irresistible current, cleansing the space, carrying away the residue of his struggle. He felt himself immersed in it, not drowning, but floating, weightless and free. A profound sense of peace, deeper than any he had ever known, enveloped him. Meanwhile, in the sterile confines of the hospital room, Aidan lay still, his breathing shallow, a ventilator hissing softly in the background. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken. The doctors had delivered their grim prognosis. Another severe seizure, prolonged coma, significant brain swelling. They spoke of brain death protocols and withdrawal of life support. Bronte wept openly, her hand clutching Aunt Sylvie's. Matteo, pale and silent, stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped. Aunt Sylvie, her face serene despite the tears in her eyes, squeezed Bronte's hand. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the sterile silence. "Not yet. Not like this." She moved to Aidan's bedside, her hand gently resting on his forehead. "His spirit is still here. He is fighting his last battle, but not alone." She turned to Bronte and Matteo. "We will not focus on this," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the monitors beeping out Aidan's precarious life signs. "We will focus on him, on his peace, on his release from suffering, no matter what form that takes. Whether he stays or whether he goes, it will be with love and with grace." Bronte, through her tears, looked at her aunt, a flicker of something akin to understanding in her eyes. Matteo, though clearly bewildered, nodded slowly. Aunt Sylvie took both their hands, guiding them to place them gently on Aidan's comatose body. Bronte's on his chest, Matteo's on his arm. "Close your eyes," Aunt Sylvie murmured, her voice a low, resonant hum. "Feel his presence. Send him your love. Not your fear, not your grief, but pure, unconditional love. Imagine a golden light surrounding him, saturating every cell, every thought, every memory. Let it wash away the fear, the pain, the struggle. Picture him at peace, whole in whatever way he needs to be. Release him from carrying our burdens, our expectations. Just peace, just love, just release. Bronte, though her mind screamed in protest, allowed herself to be guided. She focused on the love she felt for her stubborn, brilliant brother, the shared memories, the quiet moments of connection. Mateo, remembering Aiden's passion, his unwavering standards, his quiet mentorship, poured his respect and gratitude into the silent meditation. Aunt Sylvie closed her eyes, her lips moving in an almost imperceptible whisper, her face radiating a profound, ancient calm. The room, for all its medical machinery, seemed to soften, filled with an invisible, palpable current of collective intention. It was a crucible of surrender, a collective act of love, forging not a demand for a miracle, but a profound acceptance of whatever was to come, infused with an unwavering belief in Aiden's inherent wholeness. They sat like that for what felt like an eternity, a silent vigil of spirit over flesh, as Aiden, in his dream, floated on the gilded light of surrender. The sharp, searing pain behind his left eye escalated, blossoming into a blinding supernova that consumed his entire head. Aiden felt a gurgling sound rise in his throat, a desperate, animalistic cry that never fully escaped. His body convulsed, limbs flailing uncontrollably, a horrifying dance that pulled at the tubes and wires connected to him. Bronte, who had been dozing in the armchair beside his bed, jolted awake, her scream tearing through the hushed hospital room. Nurses rushed in, their movements a blur of efficiency, their voices a cacophony of medical urgency. He felt a needle prick his arm, a cold rush of liquid, and then the world fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards before dissolving into an abyss. Darkness. Not the peaceful void of sleep, but a suffocating, crushing blackness, heavy as a shroud. He was conscious yet utterly trapped, a prisoner within his own mind. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the gloom. He tried to move, to speak, to scream, but there was nothing. Only the echo of his own terror, amplified in the silent void. Time ceased to exist. Was it minutes? Hours? Days? He couldn't tell. He was a disembodied consciousness, adrift in an endless, terrifying ocean. Then a flicker, a pinprick of light, impossibly distant, growing steadily brighter. It pulled at him, a magnetic force drawing him towards it. As he neared, the light resolved into a shimmering, golden hue, warm and inviting. He felt a profound sense of peace, a release from the crushing weight of the darkness. He wasn't sure if he was still in the hospital or if this was something else entirely. All he knew was that the fear, the anger, the despair had all dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. He heard voices, faint at first, then clearer. They were familiar, interwoven with love and concern. Bronte's soft murmur, Mateo's earnest whisper, and then Aunt Sylvie's voice, a steady, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through his very being. "Aiden," she said, her voice clear and strong, though tinged with a deep, quiet sorrow. "Release the root, my dear. Let go of the struggle. We are here, holding you, not for you to fight, but for you to simply be." He felt a gentle warmth spread through him, a feeling of being utterly held, utterly safe. He wasn't sure what she meant by "release the root," but in this state, it resonated with the deepest part of his being. He had fought so long, so hard against everything, against the illness, against his own perceived weaknesses, against the grief he'd buried. Now, in this luminous space, he simply stopped. He surrendered to the warmth, to the voices, to the unknown. When Aiden finally emerged from the coma, it was like surfacing from the deepest ocean. The first sensation was light, blinding and intense, even through his eyelids. Then sounds, the distant hum of hospital machinery, the rustle of starched sheets, a soft sniffle. He tried to open his eyes and a wave of exhaustion washed over him. He managed a weak flutter, slowly adjusting to the dim light of the room. Bronte was there, her face drawn and tear-streaked, but her eyes were wide with a dawning hope. Aunt Sylvie sat beside her, calm and serene, a gentle smile playing on her lips. Matteo was slumped in a chair by the window, fast asleep, his head resting on a stack of medical journals. "Aiden?" Bronte's voice was a fragile whisper, as if she feared he might shatter. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, parched. He managed a raspy croak. Aunt Sylvie immediately produced a small cup of ice chips, holding it to his lips. The cold felt exquisite, a tiny spark of life. "Welcome back, dear heart," Aunt Sylvie said, her voice filled with a quiet joy. "You gave us quite a scare." He spent the next few days in a haze of weakness, punctuated by short bursts of lucidity. The doctors, usually so professional and reserved, seemed to be constantly in and out, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and cautious optimism. Dr. Albright, her brow furrowed in concentration, explained that his seizure had been severe, leading to a prolonged coma. They had prepared Bronte and Aunt Sylvie for the worst, discussing palliative care options. "We ordered a follow-up MRI, Aiden," Dr. Albright said one morning, her voice carefully neutral, yet with an underlying tremor of disbelief. "It was a routine check, purely to gauge the extent of the damage, to help us plan for—" She trailed off, then took a deep breath. "Aiden, the glioblastoma. It's gone." A cold shock coursed through him, immediately followed by a wave of dizzying disbelief. "Gone?" he rasped, the single word a question, a plea, a demand. Dr. Albright nodded, her eyes wide. "Or at least," she corrected herself, gesturing to the new scans displayed on a tablet. "What was once an active, aggressive tumor is now scar tissue. There's no active growth, no enhancement, no vascularity. It's inexplicable. Medically, we call it a spontaneous regression. It's incredibly rare for a grade 4 GBM, a statistical anomaly." She looked at him, her gaze piercing, as if trying to find the answer in his eyes. "We've run the scans 3 times, consulted with colleagues. It's definitive." Bronte gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Aunt Sylvie simply closed her eyes, a silent prayer of gratitude on her lips. Matteo, having been woken by the commotion, stood frozen, staring at the screen, his mouth agape. Aiden looked at the scans. Where the monstrous, consuming shadow had once been, there was now only a faint, almost translucent wisp, a ghost of its former self. He felt no sudden burst of triumphant elation, no wild celebratory shout. Instead, a profound, quiet understanding settled over him. It wasn't just the tumor that had disappeared. It was the crushing weight of his control, the suffocating fear, the buried grief. The battle against the monstrous doe, the surrender to the luminous river in his dream. It had been real. He hadn't just been battling a physical mass. He had been battling the manifestation of his own internal blockages. "It wasn't just the tumor," Aiden whispered, his voice gaining strength. "It was the root." He looked at Aunt Sylvie, who met his gaze with a knowing smile. Dr. Albright, a woman of science, looked utterly perplexed. "The root?" Aiden managed a weak smile. "Yes, the root of it all." He didn't try to explain the journal, the dreams, the releasing of Leo's grief, the collective intention of his loved ones. He knew they wouldn't understand, but he understood. He felt a deep internal shift, a lightness he hadn't experienced in decades. The healing wasn't just physical. It was a total recalibration of his being. He still had a long way to go. His body was weak, his muscles atrophied, and his cognitive functions fuzzy from the coma. Rehabilitation would be arduous, but as he looked at the faces of his loved ones, at the quiet awe in their eyes, he knew, with a certainty that resonated through his bones, that this was not an end, but a beginning. A gilded light indeed. The suffocating darkness, once a prison, had begun to recede, replaced by a soft, diffused light. Aiden's consciousness, slowly returning, felt like a ship rising from the depths of a dark ocean, breaking the surface into a hazy dawn. He was aware of a persistent hum, the distant murmur of voices, and the gentle rhythm of his own breathing, surprisingly regular. The searing pain, the convulsion, the terrifying paralysis, all were echoes, fading like a bad dream. When he finally opened his eyes, the sterile white of the hospital room was reassuringly familiar. Bronte, her face pale and drawn, was slumped in the armchair, asleep, a faint snore escaping her lips. Aunt Sylvie sat beside his bed, a hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes closed in quiet contemplation. The room, usually a nexus of hushed worry, felt lighter, imbued with a calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. A nurse, a kind woman with tired eyes named Sarah, noticed his stirring. "Aiden, welcome back to us." Her voice was soft, laced with a relief that was almost palpable. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. Sarah offered him a sip of water, which he gratefully took, the cool liquid a balm. "What happened?" he rasped. Sarah smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "You gave us quite a scare, Chef. Another seizure, a bad one. You were out for almost 3 days." She paused, her gaze flicking towards Aunt Sylvie. "But you're back now, and feeling different?" Aiden nodded slowly. The internal landscape of his mind, once a chaotic battlefield, felt strangely serene. The monstrous doe from his dream, the one that had suffocated him until he let go, had indeed transformed. He felt lighter. Not physically, for his body was still weak, but a profound lightness in his spirit, as if a crushing weight had been lifted. Later that day, Dr. Aris, his neuro-oncologist, entered the room, his usual grave demeanor replaced by an expression of profound bewilderment. He held a stack of film, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested not concern, but utter scientific perplexity. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Aris began, his voice unusually hesitant, We ordered another MRI, a routine one, before discussing palliative care options, given your recent setback." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "What we found, it's unprecedented." Bronte, now awake and alert, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and a fragile, desperate hope. Aunt Sylvie remained silent, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. Dr. Aris held up one of the films, pointing to a specific region on the scan. The glioblastoma, while the previous necrotic tissue and some scarring remain, indicating where it was, there is no active enhancement, no new growth, no active tumor cells. He looked directly at Aiden, his gaze piercing. "It's in profound, inexplicable remission. We're calling it a spontaneous regression, Mr. Chen, a medical anomaly, a miracle, for lack of a better word." A hush fell over the room. Bronte gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. Aiden felt a surge of something akin to awe, but not surprise. He had felt it, deep within him, the moment the suffocating doe had dissolved into a luminous river. This wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was a validation of an internal shift, a profound recalibration of his very being. "So, it's gone?" Bronte whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief and relief. Dr. Aris cleared his throat. "Not gone in the sense of physically vanishing without a trace. No. The damage it caused, the scar tissue, that's still there. But the active, aggressive, malignant cells, they're inactive, dormant. We can't explain it. We'll monitor you closely, of course, but this is truly remarkable." He shook his head, a scientist grappling with the inexplicable. "The largest, most aggressive grade 4 GBM I've ever seen just stopped." Aiden closed his eyes, a deep cleansing breath filling his lungs. It wasn't the tumor that had disappeared, not truly. It was the internal storm, the unaddressed grief, the desperate clinging to control that had perhaps fueled its relentless growth. He had let go. He had surrendered. And in that surrender, the river had flowed, cleansing not just his internal landscape, but seemingly his very cells. His recovery was slow, arduous, and punctuated by moments of profound fatigue and cognitive fogginess. The physical scarring on his brain meant some lingering neurological deficits, a slight tremor in his non-dominant hand, occasional word-finding difficulties, and a need for afternoon naps. But the crushing headaches were gone, the seizures had ceased, and the profound sense of despair that had once consumed him had been replaced by a quiet, vibrant peace. He would never return to the demanding, high-stress environment of the Gilded Spoon. The thought of the meticulous perfection, the frenetic pace, the relentless pursuit of culinary control now felt alien, even suffocating. When Matteo, his loyal sous chef, came to visit, his face alight with joy at Aiden's recovery, Aiden made him an offer. "Matteo," he said, his voice raspy but clear, "the Gilded Spoon is yours. All of it. I want you to make it your own." Matteo, initially shocked, finally accepted, tears in his eyes, promising to honor Aiden's legacy, but also to infuse the restaurant with his own vibrant, community-focused vision. With Bronte's artistic guidance and Aunt Sylvie's ever-present, cryptic wisdom, Aiden embarked on a new culinary journey. He opened a small, sun-drenched studio, not a restaurant, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. He called it the Nourishing Hearth. It was a place for healing cuisine, not simply healthy food, but dishes designed to soothe the soul, ignite the senses, and foster connection. He experimented with ancient grains, forgotten herbs from Aunt Sylvie's vast botanical knowledge, and unexpected flavor combinations that spoke to the interconnectedness of body and spirit. There were no Michelin stars to chase, no critics to impress, only the quiet satisfaction of creating something truly nourishing. He hosted small, intimate workshops, often for others grappling with chronic illness or profound loss. He shared his story, not as a medical miracle, but as a journey of self-discovery, of confronting repressed grief, and of the profound power of surrender. He taught them to embrace imperfection, to find beauty in the unexpected, and to understand that true healing often began not with fighting, but with letting go. Bronte, her artistic spirit rekindled by their collaboration, created stunning botanical illustrations for his workshop materials. Her vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile hospital white. Aunt Sylvie, her eyes always twinkling with understanding, would often sit in the corner of the studio, offering quiet wisdom about the resilience of nature and the subtle energies of life. Aiden, the once obsessive chef, found a new kind of fulfillment, one rooted not in control, but in connection. He had surrendered his life to the unknown, faced his deepest fears, and in doing so, had found a richness, a depth, and a peace he had never known. The tumor had not just disappeared, it had transformed him, leading him to a life far more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. He was still Aiden, the chef, but now he cooked with a different kind of fire, one fueled by gratitude, compassion, and the quiet, gilded light of a life truly lived.